My name is Dexter Holbrook. I managed a GameStop in Billings, Montana when Yellowstone erupted and turned our world into a frozen wasteland. For 10 months I've watched civilization collapse around me while temperatures dropped below survival levels. I've killed to protect what little food I had left, lost the only family I found in this nightmare, and learned that sometimes good people become monsters when they're starving. Right now I'm walking through waist-deep snow towards smoke rising from an abandoned building, carrying my dead grandmother's revolver, and hoping the strangers inside won't try to murder me for the 3 cans of beans in my backpack. This is how I survived the first 10 months of the Ice Age apocalypse. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dexter Holbrook, and I used to think the worst thing that could happen to me was running out of the new PlayStation units during a holiday rush. I managed the GameStop on First Avenue in Billings, Montana, and I thought I knew what stress looked like. Corporate breathing down my neck about sales numbers, customers screaming about pre-orders, dealing with kids who thought they could trade in their scratched-up games for full price. That was my biggest worry back then. How incredibly stupid that seems now. I'm telling you this story because I want you to understand how quickly everything can change. How the world you know, the life you've built, the problems you think matter can all disappear in a single day. I want you to understand because maybe, just maybe, if you're listening to this, you might still have time to prepare for what's coming. Because what happened to us here in Montana, what happened to the entire world, it's not over. The Ice Age apocalypse is just getting started. Let me take you back to before everything went to hell. Before I learned that managing a video game store was actually training for the end of the world. Before I understood why my grandmother left me that old revolver when she died, telling me that someday I'd understand why a peaceful man needs to be ready for war. It was March 14th, 2025, a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were always our slowest days and I was looking forward to catching up on inventory. I'd been working at GameStop for 6 years, worked my way up from part-time associate to manager of the flagship store in downtown Billings. I was proud of that job. I know people made jokes about GameStop employees, but I genuinely loved it. I loved talking to customers about games, helping parents find the right console for their kids, running those underground tournaments in the back room after hours. The gaming community was my family, and that store was my home. That morning started like any other. I got to the store at 8:30, turned off the alarm, flipped on the lights, and started the opening routine. Check the registers, boot up the computer systems, make sure the display cases were properly locked. We'd had some issues with theft lately. Nothing major, but corporate was making us be extra careful about security. I had no idea how much that security mindset would matter later. The first customer of the day was Mrs. Chen, this elderly Chinese woman who lived in the apartment building next to the store. She came in every few weeks to buy games for her grandson in Seattle. Sweet lady, always polite, always paid an exact change. That morning she seemed different though, nervous. She kept looking around the store like she was expecting trouble. She bought every single battery we had in stock. AA, AAA, those big lantern batteries, even the weird specialty ones for old electronics. When I asked her if she was planning some kind of camping trip, she just shook her head and said her grandson told her to prepare for the long dark. I laughed. God help me. I actually laughed. I told her that sounded like something out of a post-apocalyptic video game. She didn't smile. She just looked at me with these sad, knowing eyes and said I should call my parents while I still could. I should have listened to her. Mrs. Chen had lived through things I couldn't imagine. She'd survived the Japanese occupation of China, immigrated to America with nothing, built a life from scratch. She knew what it looked like when the world started falling apart. But I was 27 years old and thought I knew everything. I rang up her batteries, made small talk about the weather, and sent her on her way without giving her warning another thought. The next customer was Mike Patterson, one of our regulars. He came in every couple weeks, usually bought electronic, accessories, charging cables, portable gaming devices. He was an electrician, worked all over town, seemed like a decent enough guy. Quiet, kept to himself, but he knew his stuff when it came to electronics. That morning he was buying a bunch of weird stuff though. Portable radios, battery packs, some kind of signal amplifier kit. When I asked him about it, he said he was working on a project, building some kind of communication setup for emergencies. I should have paid more attention to what he was actually building. I should have asked more questions, but Mike seemed harmless enough. Just another customer with a hobby. He paid for his stuff and left, but not before asking me some very specific questions about our store's backup power systems and how long our emergency lighting would last if the power went out. At the time, I thought it was just professional curiosity. Later, I would realize he was casing the place, figuring out how to survive when everything went to hell. Around noon, my phone started buzzing with news alerts. At first, it was just the usual stuff, political drama, celebrity gossip. But then I started seeing headlines about Yellowstone, seismic activity, earthquake swarms, elevated gas emissions, the kind of scientific jargon that usually meant nothing to regular people, but the alerts kept coming, and they were getting more urgent. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, every news channel was running breaking news coverage. Yellowstone National Park was being evacuated. Scientists were talking about the possibility of a major eruption, the kind of eruption that hadn't happened in over 600,000 years, the kind of eruption that could change everything. My customers that day were a mix of panic and denial. Some people were buying up portable games and electronics like they were planning to hunker down for weeks. Others were acting like nothing was happening, making jokes about the media overreacting, talking about how scientists were always predicting disasters that never came true. I fell somewhere in the middle. I was concerned, but I didn't think it would really affect us in Montana. Yellowstone was hundreds of miles away. How bad could it be? I found out just after 5 o'clock. I was getting ready to close the store when I got the call from corporate. They were implementing emergency protocols for all stores in the region. We were supposed to stay open extended hours to serve customers who might need electronics and entertainment during the crisis. They were also authorizing us to accept unusual trade-ins like jewelry and valuable items, because the credit card processing system might go down. That should have been my first real warning. When GameStop corporate starts accepting gold jewelry as payment, you know something serious is happening. But I was young and stupid and thought this was just another corporate overreaction. I figured I'd stay open a few extra hours, sell some games to nervous customers, and be home by 8 o'clock with a good story to tell. The first ash started falling around 6:30. I was helping a customer pick out a handheld gaming system when I noticed people outside pointing at the sky. At first I thought it was snowing, which would have been weird for March but not impossible, in Montana. But when I looked closer, I could see it wasn't snow. It was ash. Fine, gray ash falling like snow, coating everything in a thin layer of dust. The customer I was helping, a middle-aged woman buying games for her kids, started crying. She said her brother lived in Wyoming and had called her an hour ago saying the whole sky was black and cars were breaking down from the ash, clogging their engines. She said he told her to get her family ready to leave town, to head east as far as they could go. I sold her a car charger and a portable gaming device, told her everything would be fine, that the ash would blow over in a day or two. I had no idea what I was talking about. I had no idea that ash cloud would block out the sun for months. I had no idea that cars would indeed break down, that the highways would become graveyards of abandoned vehicles, that most of the people trying to evacuate would die somewhere along the way. By 8 o'clock, the ash was falling heavier. I could see it accumulating on the sidewalks, turning everything gray and lifeless. The streetlights were having trouble cutting through the haze, and I could barely see the traffic light at the corner. I tried calling my parents in Florida, but the call wouldn't go through. The cell towers were probably getting clogged with everyone trying to make emergency calls. I should have closed the store and tried to get home. I should have grabbed whatever supplies I could carry and started driving east like that woman's brother had suggested. But I didn't. I stayed in the store because corporate had told me to keep it open, because I thought this was temporary, because I couldn't imagine that the world was ending right outside my door. The last customer of the night was a kid, maybe 16 years old, who came in around 9 o'clock. He was covered in ash, breathing hard like he'd been running. He wanted to trade his class, ring for a portable gaming device. Said his parents were fighting about whether to leave town and he needed something to keep him distracted. I made the trade, gave him the gaming device and a car charger, told him to stay safe. I never saw him again. I don't know what happened to him or his family. I don't know if they made it out of town or if they're buried somewhere under the snow that would start falling a few weeks later. I think about him sometimes. Wonder if that gaming device gave him a few hours of peace before everything went completely to hell. After he left, I tried to call corporate to report what was happening, but I couldn't get through. The phone lines were jammed and the internet was getting spotty. I could load some websites, but not others. And the ones that did load were full of conflicting information. Some sites were saying the eruption was contained. Others were talking about global catastrophe. I didn't know what to believe. Around 10:30, I heard gunshots. They were distant, maybe a few blocks away, but definitely gunshots. I'd grown up in Montana. I knew what gunfire sounded like. My first thought was that it was probably just scared homeowners. Maybe someone shooting at shadows in the ash-filled darkness. But the shots kept coming, and they didn't sound random. They sounded organized, purposeful. I locked the front door and turned off the main lights, but kept the security system running. I had a good view of the street from the back office, and I could see people moving around out there. Some of them were carrying flashlights, others had bags slung over their shoulders. They looked like they were searching for something, or someone. That's when I realized that the world wasn't just ending because of the volcano. It was ending because of what people were doing to each other. The ash and the cold were just the beginning. The real danger was going to come from desperation, from good people making bad choices, from neighbors turning on neighbors when the food ran out. I spent that first night in the store, sitting in the back office with the lights off, watching the street through the security monitors. I saw things that night that I still have nightmares about. People breaking into the pharmacy across the street. Families loading their cars with whatever they could carry before driving off into the ash-filled darkness. A fight between two men over a cart full of groceries that ended with one of them on the ground, not moving. The next morning, the ash was still falling. If anything, it was worse. The sky was completely gray, and you couldn't see more than a block in any direction. The street was covered in a thick layer of ash that looked like dirty snow. Most of the other businesses on the block were closed, their windows covered with hastily made signs saying they'd be back when things got better. I tried calling corporate again, but still couldn't get through. I tried calling my parents, my few friends in town, even the local police. Nothing. The phone system was either down or so overloaded that it might as well have been down. I was completely cut off from the outside world, alone in a video game store with no idea what was happening beyond what I could see through the windows. That's when I made the decision that would save my life. I decided to stay in the store and wait it out. I had food in the employee break room, bottled water, a bathroom, and enough entertainment to last for weeks. The building was solid with good locks and a security system. Most importantly, it wasn't my home address. If people were making lists of places to rob, they'd start with residential areas, not retail stores. I spent the next few days learning how to be a survivor instead of a store manager. I moved all the valuable merchandise to the back room and created a living space in the office. I rationed the food I had, making a mental inventory of what I could scavenge from nearby businesses if I had to. I started keeping a log of everyone I saw outside, noting their behavior patterns, their routes, their potential threat level. It was like studying NPC movements in a stealth game, except the consequences of getting caught were real. The first week was the hardest. The ash kept falling, the temperature kept dropping, and the number of people on the street kept decreasing. I watched the pharmacy across the street get looted 3 different times. I watched a family with 2 small children break down crying in the middle of the street when their car wouldn't start. I watched an old man collapse from exhaustion just outside my window, and I was too scared to help him. That's when I learned the first rule of survival. You can't save everyone. You can barely save yourself. Every choice you make to help someone else is a choice that might get you killed. It sounds heartless, and it is, but it's also true. The people who survived the first month weren't the heroes. They were the ones who learned to be selfish when they had to be. By the end of the first week, I realized that this wasn't temporary. The ash wasn't going to stop falling. The temperature wasn't going to go back to normal. The government wasn't going to fix this. This was the new reality, and I had to adapt or die. I started making lists. What supplies did I have? What did I need? Where could I get them safely? I had plenty of electronics, but electronics don't keep you warm or fed. I had a little food, but not enough, for more than a few weeks. I had weapons, sort of, if you counted the baseball bat we kept behind the counter for security, but I'd never used a weapon against another person in my life. That's when I remembered my grandmother's revolver. She'd left it to me when she died. 2 years earlier, along with a box of ammunition and a note saying that someday I'd understand why a peaceful man needs to be ready for war. I'd kept it locked in my apartment, never fired it, barely even looked at it. But now, with the world falling apart outside my window, I was starting to understand what she meant. The second week was when I learned how to scavenge. The ash had stopped falling as heavily, but the temperature was still dropping. I could see my breath inside the store, even with the heating system running. I knew I had to start gathering supplies before the power went out completely. I made my first supply run to the grocery store 2 blocks away. It had been looted pretty thoroughly, but there were still some canned goods scattered around, stuff that people had overlooked or dropped during the chaos. I filled a backpack with whatever I could find and made it back to the store without being seen. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me alive for another week or two. The hardest part wasn't the physical danger, though that was real enough. The hardest part was the isolation. I was used to talking to people all day, helping customers, joking with coworkers, being part of a community. Now I was alone, surrounded by silence broken only by the wind and the occasional distant sound of someone else fighting to survive. I started talking to myself just to hear a human voice. I'd have conversations with imaginary customers, practice, sales pitches for games that would never be delivered, narrate my daily activities like I was streaming a survival game online. It sounds crazy, but it kept me sane during those first few weeks when I thought I might be the only person left alive in the entire city. By the third week, I could see that other people were adapting too. The random violence of the first week had died down, replaced by something more organized. I started seeing the same faces on the street, people who had claimed territory, established routines, figured out how to survive. Some of them looked friendly enough, others made me glad I'd reinforced the store's doors and windows. There was one guy in particular who caught my attention. He seemed to spend a lot of time near the old Radio Shack across the street, always watching, always alert. I could never get a clear look at him, but something about his movements seemed professional. Military, maybe, or police. He knew how to stay hidden, how to observe without being seen. Part of me wanted to make contact, but another part of me was terrified of what he might want. The fourth week was when I realized that the government wasn't coming to save us. We'd been hearing emergency broadcasts on the radio, telling people to stay calm, stay in their homes, wait for help. But the broadcasts were getting less frequent, and they were starting to sound desperate. The last one I heard was just a recorded message playing on loop, telling people to conserve food and water and avoid unnecessary travel. That's when I knew for certain that we were on our own. Whatever was happening in the wider world, whether it was just regional or global, the authorities either couldn't or wouldn't help us. We were going to have to save ourselves, and most of us weren't going to make it. I spent the rest of that first month learning how to be someone I never thought I'd have to be. I learned how to move silently through the ash-covered streets. I learned how to spot the signs of desperation in other people's faces. I learned how to make hard choices about who to help and who to avoid. Most importantly, I learned that the skills I'd developed managing a GameStop, dealing with difficult customers, organizing inventory, mediating disputes between gamers, were actually survival skills. I just hadn't realized it yet. The temperature kept dropping. By the end of March, it was below freezing every night, and the ash was mixing with snow. Real snow, not volcanic ash, which meant the climate was changing fast. I could see ice forming on the windows and my breath fogging up even inside the store. I knew I had to find a better way to stay warm, or I wasn't going to survive the coming winter. That's when I started thinking about finding other people. Not just any people, but the right people. People with skills I didn't have. People I could trust. People who understood that we were stronger together than apart. I'd always been good at building communities, even if it was just a community of gamers hanging out in a strip mall store. Maybe I could do it again, even in hell. I had no idea how much I'd need those community building skills. I had no idea that the people I was about to meet would become my family, my salvation, and eventually my greatest threat. I had no idea that learning to manage a video game store was just the beginning of my education in human nature. The first thing I learned about survival is that it's not about being tough or brave. It's about being organized. Lucky for me, I'd spent 6 years learning how to manage inventory, track resources, and deal with people who wanted things I didn't have enough of. Turns out those skills translate pretty well to staying alive when the world ends. By May, the ash had mostly stopped falling, but the damage was done. The sky stayed this sickly gray color, like looking through dirty glass, and the temperature never got above 40 degrees even during the day. I could see frost on the windows every morning, and I knew it was only going to get worse. The volcanic winter had started, and according to what I could piece together from the radio broadcast that still worked, it was happening everywhere. I'd been living in the GameStop for 6 weeks by then, and I'd developed a routine that kept me sane. Wake up at 7, check the security monitors, eat a small breakfast of whatever canned goods I'd scavenged, spend the morning organizing supplies and planning the day's activities. Afternoons were for maintenance, keeping the store clean and functional, testing equipment, updating my logs. Evenings were for observation, watching the street through the windows, tracking the movements of other survivors. That's when I started noticing patterns. There were maybe 20 people left in a 6-block radius, and they'd all established territories and routines. The woman with the shopping cart who collected cans from the dumpsters behind the restaurants. The man with the military jacket who checked the abandoned cars for useful supplies. The family with 2 kids who ventured out only in the early morning when fewer people were around. And then there was the watcher. He stayed near the old radio shack across the street, and he was good at staying hidden. Really good. Sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of him through my binoculars, just a shadow moving behind the broken windows or a figure ducking behind the counter when he thought someone was looking. But I could tell he was watching everything that happened on the street, watching and learning just like I was. Part of me wanted to make contact. After 6 weeks of talking to myself, I was desperate for human conversation. But another part of me was terrified. This guy moved like he had training, like he knew what he was doing. That could mean he was military or police, someone who might help, but it could also mean he was dangerous, someone who saw other survivors as threats to eliminate. I decided to wait and observe. I kept detailed notes about everyone I saw, tracking their routines, their behavior, their potential threat level. The watcher got his own page in my notebook, with careful observations about his movements, his equipment, his apparent skills. I treated it like studying NPCs in a stealth game, except the consequences of making a mistake were permanent. My first real scavenging run happened in late May. I'd been putting it off, surviving on the snacks and drinks from the store's inventory, but I was running low on actual food. The grocery store 2 blocks away had been picked over pretty thoroughly, but I figured there might still be things people had missed or couldn't carry. I went out at 4 in the morning when the street was empty and dark. I'd practiced moving quietly around the store, learning how to walk without making noise, how to avoid the creaky floorboards and loose fixtures. Now I had to apply those skills in the real world where making noise could get me killed. The grocery store was a mess. Shelves turned over, broken glass everywhere, the smell of spoiled food mixing with the metallic scent of blood. Someone had died in there probably weeks ago, and I tried not to look too closely at the dark stains on the floor. I focused on my mission, searching through the debris for anything useful. I found more than I expected. A case of canned soup, hidden behind some fallen shelving. A bag of rice that had been torn open but was still mostly intact. Some medical supplies from the pharmacy section that hadn't been completely cleaned out. Most importantly, I found a camping stove and a supply of fuel canisters. With winter coming, being able to cook warm food could mean the difference between life and death. Loading everything into a shopping cart, I made my way back to the store just as the sun was coming up. That's when I saw him. The watcher. He was standing in the doorway of the radio shack, completely still, completely focused on me. For maybe 30 seconds, we just looked at each other across the empty street. Then he stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. That encounter changed everything. Now I knew for certain that he was aware of me. and I had to assume he'd been tracking my movements just like I'd been tracking his. The question was what he planned to do about it. Was he waiting for me to make a mistake so he could take over my territory? Was he planning to approach me for some kind of alliance? Or was he just gathering information, learning my weaknesses, so he could strike when the time was right? I started carrying my grandmother's revolver on every trip outside the store. I'd finally worked up the courage to get it from my apartment during one of my scavenging runs, along with the box of ammunition and her note about peaceful men and war. The weight of it in my jacket pocket was both comforting and terrifying. I'd never fired it, never even pointed it at another person, but I knew the time was coming when I might have to. The radio broadcasts were getting stranger. Instead of official emergency information, I started picking up conversations between survivor groups, people using code words, arranging meetings, trading information about resources and threats. It was like listening to a post-apocalyptic version of CB radio chatter, except these people were talking about real life and death situations. One conversation I heard in early June still gives me chills. Two groups were coordinating an attack on what they called a supply horde. They talked about it like a military operation, discussing entry points, weapons, how to divide the spoils. At the end of the conversation, one of them mentioned eliminating any witnesses. They were talking about murdering people for their food, and they sounded completely casual about it. That's when I realized that the real danger wasn't going to be the cold or the hunger. It was going to be other people, desperate people who'd decided that their survival was more important than anyone else's life. People who'd crossed lines they never thought they'd cross and found it easier than they expected. I started reinforcing the store's defenses. I moved heavy display cases in front of the windows, created multiple exit routes, set up early warning systems using the store's security equipment. I also started practicing with the revolver, dry firing it in the back room, learning how the trigger felt, how to aim properly. I told myself it was just preparation, that I'd probably never have to use it. But deep down, I knew better. Mrs. Chen came by in early June. I hadn't seen her since that first day when she bought all the batteries, and I was shocked by how much she'd changed. She'd lost weight, her clothes were dirty and patched, and she had this haunted look in her eyes that I was starting to recognize in other survivors. But she was alive, which was more than I could say for most of the people I'd known before the eruption. She told me about what was happening in the residential areas. Families turning on each other when the food ran out. Neighbors stealing from neighbors. Groups of people banding together to take supplies from anyone weaker than them. She said her apartment building had become a fortress, with the remaining residents taking shifts guarding the entrances and pooling their resources. But she was worried about her grandson. He was supposed to come get her when things got bad, drive her to some relatives in North Dakota. She hadn't heard from him since the phones went down, and she was starting to think something had happened to him. She asked if I'd seen any young Asian men in the area, described her grandson in detail, begged me to let her know if I spotted him. I promised I would, but privately I doubted her grandson was still alive. The roads out of town were littered with abandoned vehicles, and anyone who'd tried to evacuate during those first chaotic weeks had probably died somewhere along the way. But I didn't have the heart to tell her that. Hope was one of the few things that kept people sane in this new world, and I wasn't going to take that away from her. She also gave me some practical advice that probably saved my life. She'd lived through rationing during World War II, and she knew how to make food last, how to stay warm with limited resources, how to spot the signs of malnutrition and disease. Most importantly, she taught me how to read people's faces, how to tell the difference between someone who was scared and someone who was dangerous. Before she left, she mentioned hearing voices in the basement of her apartment building, voices that didn't belong to any of the residents. She said they talked about supplies, about targets, about people who had things they wanted. It sounded like one of the raider groups I'd been hearing about on the radio, and the thought of them operating so close to my location made my blood run cold. July was when I saw my first real violence. I was doing an early morning supply run to the hardware store when I heard shouting from the direction of the community center. Through my binoculars, I could see a crowd of people gathered around the building, and it looked like some kind of confrontation was happening. The community center had been set up as an official emergency shelter during the first week after the eruption. The government had stocked it with food, medical supplies, and temporary sleeping arrangements for people who'd lost their homes. For a while, it had been a symbol of hope, proof that civilization was still functioning, that help was coming. But by July, the government supplies had run out, and the people running the shelter were getting desperate. They'd started rationing food more strictly, turning away new arrivals, making hard choices about who deserved help and who didn't. The crowd I was watching through my binoculars was made up of people who'd been turned away, and they weren't taking no for an answer. What happened next was like watching the collapse of civilization in fast forward. The argument escalated into shoving. The shoving turned into fighting, and within minutes there were people on the ground bleeding, while others ran away with armloads of supplies. I watched the last official authority in our area fall apart in less than an hour, destroyed by the very people it was trying to help. That's when I knew for certain that we were completely on our own. There would be no government rescue, no military intervention, no return to the old world. Whatever came next, we were going to have to build it ourselves, and most of us weren't going to survive long enough to see it happen. The Watcher approached me in August. I was coming back from a supply run to the abandoned pharmacy when I found him waiting inside my store. He'd gotten through all my security measures without triggering a single alarm, and he was sitting calmly behind the counter like he owned the place. My first instinct was to run, but he held up his hands in a peaceful gesture and said he just wanted to talk. His name was Mike Patterson, and I realized I'd met him before. He was the electrician who'd bought all those electronics during the first week, the one who'd asked about the store's backup power systems. Now I understood why those questions had seemed so specific. He'd been planning for this moment from the beginning, learning everything he could about my defenses so he could bypass them when he was ready. Mike was maybe 40 years old, average height and build. But there was something about the way he moved that suggested military training. He spoke quietly, kept his hands visible, made no sudden movements. He was being very careful not to provoke me, which meant he'd probably seen the revolver in my jacket pocket and knew I was armed. He told me he'd been watching me for months, tracking my routines, learning about my skills and resources. He said he was impressed by how I'd adapted to the situation, how I'd managed to stay alive and relatively comfortable while so many others had died or disappeared. He wanted to propose an alliance. Mike had been living in the Radio Shack using his electrical skills to jury-rig power systems and communication equipment. He'd made contact with other survivor groups in the region, mapped out the territories controlled by hostile raiders, identified sources of supplies and potential threats. He had information I needed, and I had resources he wanted. But there was something about him that made me nervous. Maybe it was the way he asked very specific questions about my food supplies, or how he seemed to know more about my daily routine than he should have. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing around the store, like he was making mental notes about everything he saw. Or maybe it was just my paranoia talking, the result of months of isolation and stress. Still, I was desperate for human contact, and Mike seemed competent and knowledgeable. We agreed to a trial partnership, sharing information and resources while maintaining our separate living spaces. He would continue operating out of the Radio Shack, and I would keep the GameStop as my base. We would coordinate our scavenging runs, share intelligence about threats in the area, and watch each other's backs. The first few weeks of our partnership went well. Mike introduced me to Sarah, a woman who'd been living in the basement of the old bank building. She was a nurse, maybe 35 years old, with short brown hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. She'd been treating injured survivors in exchange for food and supplies, but she was running low on medical equipment and needed help securing more. Sarah had a different energy than Mike. Where he was, calculating and careful, she was driven by compassion. She'd patch up anyone who came to her, no questions asked, no payment required if they couldn't afford it. She told me stories about treating gang members who'd been shot during turf wars, families who'd been injured during failed escape attempts, children who were slowly starving because their parents couldn't find enough food. The three of us made a good team. Mike had the technical skills and strategic thinking, Sarah had the medical knowledge and human connections, and I had the organizational abilities and secure base of operations. We started coordinating our activities, sharing resources, creating something that almost felt like a normal life. But there were signs of trouble from the beginning. Mike always volunteered for night watch, saying he was an insomniac anyway. But I started to wonder what he was really doing during those long hours alone. Sarah mentioned that she'd been a trauma nurse in Detroit before moving to Montana, that she'd treated gunshot wounds and stabbed victims on a regular basis. She said she'd seen enough violence for one lifetime. But the way she said it made me think there was more to the story. And then there were the questions Mike kept asking. How? Much food did I have stored? Where did I keep my most valuable supplies? What were my plans if we had to evacuate quickly? He called it professional curiosity, strategic planning, but it felt like he was probing for weaknesses. I started keeping some supplies hidden, stuff that Mike and Sarah didn't know about. Call it insurance or paranoia, but something told me that complete trust was a luxury I couldn't afford. I'd learned to read people during my years in retail, dealing with customers who were trying to scam the system or employees who were skimming from the register. Mike and Sarah seemed genuine, but I'd been wrong about people before. The first snow fell in September. Not volcanic ash this time, but real snow, which meant the climate change was accelerating. The temperature was dropping faster than anyone had predicted, and I realized we were heading into a winter that most of us wouldn't survive. That's when we started making serious plans for long-term survival. We calculated our food supplies, identified sources of fuel and warm clothing, mapped out escape routes in case we had to abandon our current positions. The math was terrifying. Even with our combined resources, we had maybe enough supplies to last until spring, and that was assuming we didn't encounter any major setbacks. Sarah suggested we try to make contact with other survivor groups, maybe form a larger alliance that could share resources and provide mutual protection. Mike was more cautious, arguing that other groups were just as likely to try to rob us as help us. I found myself somewhere in the middle, wanting to trust people but knowing that trust could get us killed. We heard about the family that got murdered for their canned goods in October. It happened in the residential area about a mile from our location. A group of raiders had broken into a house where a family of 4 had been hoarding food. They killed everyone, including the children, and took everything of value. Mike was very interested in the details. He wanted to know how the raiders had found the house, how they'd gotten inside, what kind of weapons they'd used. He said it was important tactical information, that we needed to understand how these groups operated so we could defend against them. But there was something about his questions that bothered me, like he was taking notes for future reference. Mrs. Chen stopped coming by in November. I waited for her usual visits, watched for her familiar figure walking carefully down the ash-covered sidewalks, but she never appeared. I tried to convince myself that she'd finally found her grandson, that they'd escaped to somewhere safer, but deep down, I knew something had happened to her. I found her body in December. I was doing a supply run to the apartment building where she lived when I discovered her in the basement. She'd been dead for weeks, probably since early November. Someone had killed her for her supplies, taken everything she'd managed to gather during the months since the eruption. Her small stockpile of food and medicine was gone, along with the batteries she'd bought that first day and probably saved. Her life a dozen times over. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was finding evidence that she'd been tortured. Someone had hurt her, trying to get information about where she'd hidden her most valuable supplies. They'd made an old woman suffer before they killed her, all for a few cans of soup and some medical supplies. When I told Mike and Sarah about finding Mrs. Chen, Mike asked a lot of questions about what I'd discovered in her apartment. He wanted to know if I'd found any supplies the killers had missed, if there were signs of how they'd gotten into the building, if I'd seen any evidence about who might have been responsible. He said we needed to understand the threat, but something about his curiosity didn't feel right. Sarah's reaction was different. She just got quiet and sad, like she'd lost a friend. She said Mrs. Chen had come to her for medicine a few times, that she'd been a sweet old lady who deserved better than dying alone and afraid. Sarah made me promise that if anything happened to her, I wouldn't let her end up like that. That promise would haunt me later, when I understood what Sarah was really asking for. By December, it was clear that we weren't going to make it through the winter with our current supplies. The temperature was dropping below zero most nights, and we were burning through fuel trying to stay warm. Our food situation was getting desperate, and the few sources of supplies we'd been relying on were either exhausted or too dangerous to access. That's when Mike started talking about hard choices. He said sometimes good people have to do bad things to survive. That morality was a luxury we couldn't afford anymore. He suggested we needed to start thinking about taking supplies from people who had more than they needed, people who were too weak to defend themselves. Sarah pushed back against this kind of thinking, arguing that we had to maintain our humanity, even in impossible circumstances. But I could see the doubt in her eyes, the fear that we were all going to die if we didn't do something drastic. The worst part was that Mike's logic made sense, even if it felt wrong. We were starving, and there were people out there who had food. The math was simple, even if the morality wasn't. That's when I started sleeping with my grandmother's revolver under my pillow. Not because I was afraid of raiders or strangers, but because I was starting to be afraid of the people I trusted most. Mike's questions were getting more pointed, his suggestions more extreme. Sarah was pulling away, spending more time alone, avoiding eye contact when we talked about our dwindling supplies. I realized that the real test wasn't whether I could survive the cold or the hunger. The real test was whether I could survive the people who were supposed to be my family. When desperation finally pushed them over the edge, they'd been walking for months. Winter was coming, and I had a feeling that not all three of us were going to see spring. The thing about finding family in the apocalypse is that you don't get to choose them the way you would in normal times. You find people who are useful, people who can help you survive, and you hope that somewhere along the way they become people you can trust. Sometimes it works out. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the people who save your life are the same ones who'll try to end it when things get desperate enough. September 2025 was when our little survival group really started to feel like a family. The three of us had been working together for about a month, and we'd developed routines that kept us all alive and relatively comfortable. Mike would handle the technical stuff, maintaining our communication equipment and electrical systems. Sarah would take care of medical issues and make contact with other survivors who needed help. I would manage our supplies and coordinate our activities, using the same organizational skills that had made me a decent store manager back when that job mattered. We'd set up a pretty good operation. Mike had rigged solar panels to charge batteries during the day, giving us limited power for essential equipment. Sarah had created a basic medical clinic in the basement of the bank building, stocked with supplies we'd scavenged from abandoned pharmacies and medical offices. I'd turned the GameStop into our main supply depot, with carefully organized stockpiles of food, water, fuel, and other necessities. For the first time since the eruption, I felt like I wasn't just surviving. I was living. We had shared meals in the evening, sitting around a small camping stove and talking about our plans for the next day. We told stories about our lives before the disaster, shared memories of the world we'd lost, made jokes about the absurdity of our current situation. Sarah would talk about her work as a trauma nurse in Detroit, how she'd ended up in Montana looking for a quieter life just months before everything went to hell. Mike would describe some of his electrical projects, the satisfaction of solving complex technical problems with limited resources. Those conversations were precious to me. After months of isolation, having people to talk to felt like a miracle. But even during our best moments, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Mike had this way of asking questions that seemed casual but felt like interrogation. He wanted to know about my family, my background, my plans for the future. When I mentioned that my parents were in Florida, he asked detailed questions about our relationship, how often we talked, whether they knew about my survival preparations. Sarah was different. She was genuinely interested in people, in their stories and their well-being. But she also had this sadness about her that went deeper than just grief for the lost world. Sometimes I'd catch her staring off into the distance with this haunted expression, like she was remembering something she wished she could forget. When I asked her about it, she'd just say that she'd seen too much violence in her work as a nurse, that she was tired of patching people up just so they could go out and hurt each other again. October was our golden month. The three of us worked together like we'd been a team for years. We'd established contact with several other survivor groups in the region, creating a loose network of mutual aid and information sharing. Sarah would provide medical care to people from other communities, and in exchange they'd share intelligence about raider movements, supply locations, and safe routes through the city. Mike had become our intelligence officer, monitoring radio communications and mapping the territories controlled by different groups. He'd identified at least 4 major raider gangs operating in our area, along with a dozen smaller survivor communities trying to stay under the radar. The information he gathered was incredibly valuable, but I noticed that he was particularly interested in the communities that had large stockpiles of supplies. He'd ask detailed questions about their defenses, their leadership structure, their daily routines. I told myself it was just strategic thinking. You had to understand the threats and opportunities in your environment if you wanted to survive. But there was something about the way Mike collected information that reminded me of the questions he'd asked about Mrs. Chen's apartment after we found her body. Too specific, too focused on vulnerabilities. Sarah and I grew closer during those weeks. She'd come by the GameStop in the evenings after finishing her medical work, and we'd talk about everything and nothing while sorting supplies or planning the next day's activities. She told me about growing up in a rough neighborhood in Detroit, how becoming a nurse had been her way out of a life that seemed predetermined. She'd worked in emergency rooms for 10 years, treating gunshot wounds and overdoses and domestic violence cases, until she'd finally burned out and decided to start over somewhere peaceful. That's when she mentioned that she'd treated gang members during her time in Detroit. She said it was part of the job, that doctors and nurses don't get to choose their patients based on what they've done. But the way she talked about it made me think there was more to the story. She'd patch up gang members, no questions asked, and they'd respect her neutrality. It was an arrangement that kept her safe but also put her in the middle of situations most people never see. I started to understand why Sarah was so insistent that we maintain our humanity even in desperate circumstances. She'd seen what happened when people decided that survival justified any action, when communities turned into predators feeding on each other. She was determined not to let that happen to us, not to become the kind of people who would torture an old woman for a few cans of soup. But Mike had different ideas about what survival required. As the weather got colder and our supplies started running low, he began talking more openly about the need to make hard choices. He'd point out communities that had more food than they could use, families that were hoarding supplies while their neighbors starved. He'd suggest that maybe we had a responsibility to redistribute those resources, to take from people who had too much and give to people who had nothing. The logic was seductive, especially when you were looking at your own dwindling food supplies and calculating how many weeks you had left before starvation. But there was something about the way Mike talked about these operations that bothered me. He wasn't talking about desperate acts of survival. He was talking about strategy, about planning and execution and minimizing risks. He was talking like someone who'd done this kind of thing before. November was when the cracks started showing. The temperature was dropping below freezing every night, and we were burning through our fuel supplies trying to stay warm. Our food situation was getting critical, and the sources we'd been relying on were either exhausted or too dangerous to access. The raider groups were getting more aggressive, expanding their territories and attacking smaller communities that couldn't defend themselves. That's when we heard about the family that got murdered for their canned goods. It happened in the residential area about a mile from our location, in a house where a family of 4 had been trying to ride out the winter. According to the reports we got from other survivors, a group of raiders had broken in during the night, killed everyone including 2 children under 10 years old, and taken everything edible in the house. Mike was fascinated by the details. He wanted to know how the raiders had identified the house as a target, how they'd gotten inside without triggering any alarms, what kind of weapons they'd used, how long the whole operation had taken. He said it was important tactical information, that we needed to understand how these groups operated so we could defend against our own position. But his questions felt wrong to me. Instead of focusing on how to protect innocent people, he seemed more interested in how to replicate the raiders' success. He asked about the family's security measures, their daily routines, whether they'd made any mistakes that had given away their location. It was like he was taking notes for future reference, learning from their techniques instead of mourning their victims. Sarah's reaction was completely different. She just got quiet and sad, like she'd lost family members. She said she'd treated one of the children a few weeks earlier, a little girl with a respiratory infection who'd needed antibiotics. She'd given the family medical supplies and advice about staying warm, and now they were all dead because someone wanted their food. That's when Sarah made me promise something that would haunt me later. She said that if anything ever happened to her, if she was ever in a situation where she was going to be tortured or abused, she wanted me to make sure it ended quickly. She said she'd rather die with dignity than suffer the way Mrs. Chen had suffered. At the time, I thought she was just being dramatic, processing the trauma of living in a world where old women got tortured for soup cans. I had no idea she was asking me to be prepared to kill her. December brought the first real snow, and with it the realization that we weren't going to make it through the winter with our current supplies. We did the math over and over, calculating calories and fuel consumption, and trying to find a scenario where all three of us survived until spring. The numbers didn't work. Even with strict rationing, even if we managed to scavenge additional supplies, we were looking at starvation by February or March. That's when Mike started making more specific suggestions about acquiring resources from other communities. He'd identified several groups that had significant food stockpiles, families and small communities that were better prepared than we were. He argued that it was survival of the fittest, that the people who'd been smart enough or lucky enough to gather more supplies had a responsibility to share with those who hadn't been as fortunate. Sarah pushed back hard against this kind of thinking. She said that once you started justifying theft and violence in the name of survival, you'd crossed a line you couldn't uncross. She argued that our humanity was the only thing that separated us from the raider groups, that losing our moral compass was worse than dying with our principles intact. I found myself caught in the middle, understanding both perspectives but unable to choose between them. Mike's logic made sense from a purely practical standpoint. We were going to die if we didn't acquire more resources, and there were people out there who had more than they needed. But Sarah was right about the moral implications. Once you decided that your survival justified taking someone else's life, where did you draw the line? How many people would you kill to keep yourself alive? The arguments between Mike and Sarah became more frequent and more intense as the month progressed. Mike would point out specific targets, communities that were vulnerable or had valuable supplies. Sarah would argue for alternatives, suggesting that we should try to negotiate with these groups, offer services in exchange for resources, find ways to cooperate instead of taking what we needed by force. But Mike had an answer for every objection. He'd point out that other communities had already rejected our offers of cooperation, that they were suspicious of outsiders and protective of their resources. He'd describe the raider groups that were operating in the area, arguing that if we didn't take these supplies, someone else would, and at least we'd use them to help people instead of just enriching ourselves. I started to notice that Mike was spending more time on his radio equipment, monitoring communications between different survivor groups. He said he was gathering intelligence about threats in the area, but I began to wonder if he was actually coordinating with some of those threats. The way he talked about raider tactics, the detailed questions he asked about community defenses, the specific intelligence he seemed to have about supply locations, it all suggested a level of knowledge that came from more than just casual observation. Sarah noticed it too. She started asking. Mike pointed questions about his background, his previous experience with survival situations, how he'd learned so much about tactical operations. Mike would deflect these questions, saying he'd learned everything from books and radio communications, that he was just naturally good at strategic thinking. But Sarah had worked in emergency rooms in Detroit for 10 years. She knew what it looked like when someone was lying about their past, when someone had experience with violence they didn't want to admit. She started pulling away from Mike, spending less time in group discussions, avoiding one-on-one conversations with him. That's when I realized that Sarah was scared of Mike, and if someone with her background was scared of him, maybe I should be too. I started sleeping with my grandmother's revolver under my pillow in December, not because I was afraid of raiders or strangers breaking into the store, but because I was starting to be afraid of the people I trusted most. Mike's suggestions about acquiring resources were becoming more detailed and more specific. He'd identified A family about 2 miles away that had a significant food stockpile and minimal defenses. He'd mapped out their daily routines, identified the best times to approach their location, calculated how many people it would take to overwhelm their security measures. When I asked him how he'd gathered such detailed intelligence about this family, Mike said he'd been watching them for weeks, learning their patterns the same way we'd learned about raider movements. But there was something about the way he described his surveillance that felt professional, like he'd done this kind of reconnaissance before. Sarah refused to have anything to do with Mike's plans. She said that if we attacked innocent people for their supplies, we'd be no different from the raiders who'd killed Mrs. Chen and the family with the children. She threatened to leave our group if we went through with any of Mike's suggestions, to strike out on her own rather than be complicit in what she called murder. Mike's response to Sarah's ultimatum was telling. Instead of trying to convince her that his plans were morally justified, he started talking about the practical problems her departure would cause. He pointed out that she knew too much about our operations, our supply locations, our defensive capabilities. He suggested that if she left our group, she might share that information with other communities, either voluntarily or under duress if she was captured by raiders. The implication was clear. Mike was suggesting that we couldn't afford to let Sarah leave, that she knew too much to be allowed to go free. He wasn't saying we should kill her, not explicitly, but the subtext was unmistakable. Sarah had become a security risk, and Mike thought security risks needed to be eliminated. That's when I understood what kind of person Mike really was. All those questions about community defenses, all that interest in raider tactics, all those detailed plans for acquiring resources. He wasn't a survivor learning how to protect himself. He was a predator learning how to hunt more effectively. I also understood why Sarah had made me promise to make sure her death was quick if she was ever in danger of being tortured. She'd figured out what Mike was long before I had, and she was preparing for the possibility that our little family was going to turn on her. The worst part was that Mike's plans might actually work. The family he'd identified really did have more food than they could use, and their defenses really were minimal. A coordinated attack by 3 people could overwhelm them easily, especially if we struck at night when they were sleeping. We could take everything they had and disappear before anyone realized what had happened. But that would make us murderers. That would make us the kind of people who killed families for canned goods, the kind of people we'd been hiding from for months. And once we crossed that line, where would it end? How many families would we have to kill to keep ourselves alive? Through the winter? I started making my own plans in late December, preparations that had nothing to do with Mike's schemes for attacking other survivors. I identified escape routes from the store, places where I could hide supplies that Mike didn't know about, ways to contact other communities if I needed help. I also started carrying the revolver with me at all times, even when I was just moving around inside the store, because I was beginning to understand that the biggest threat to my survival wasn't the cold or the hunger or the raider groups operating in our area. The biggest threat was the man who'd been watching me for months, learning my routines and my weaknesses, planning for the moment when he'd decide I was no longer useful to him. Mike had spent months gaining my trust, becoming part of my family, learning everything there was to know about my resources and my capabilities. And now that winter was here and desperation was setting in, he was getting ready to use all that knowledge against me. The question was whether I'd figure out his intentions in time to do something about it, or whether I'd end up like Mrs. Chen, tortured for information before being eliminated as a witness. January 2026 was when everything fell apart. Not just our little group, but my entire understanding of who I could trust and what people were capable of when they got desperate enough. I'd thought I understood human nature from my years managing a GameStop, dealing with difficult customers and mediating disputes between gamers. But retail politics and end-of-the-world survival are 2 completely different games, and the stakes for making mistakes are permanent. The month started with a blizzard that lasted 4 days straight, the kind of storm that would have been newsworthy in normal times, but now was just another reminder that the climate had changed permanently. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero, and the wind was so strong it shook the entire building. We were trapped inside our respective shelters, unable to venture out even for essential supplies. That's when our food situation became critical. We'd been rationing carefully for weeks, but 4 days of being unable to scavenge meant we were looking at our reserves disappearing faster than we'd calculated. By my count, we had maybe 3 weeks of food left if we cut our portions to starvation levels. Mike's calculations were even more pessimistic. He said we had 2 weeks at most, and that was assuming we didn't encounter any other setbacks. Sarah suggested we try to contact some of the other survivor communities, see if anyone was willing to trade medical services for food. She'd built up a good reputation treating people throughout the region, and there were several groups that owed her favors. But Mike shot down that idea immediately. He said the storm had probably affected everyone equally, that other communities would be just as desperate as we were, that asking for help would just reveal our weakness to potential threats. That's when Mike brought up his plan again. The family he'd been watching, the ones with the significant food stockpile and minimal defenses. He said the storm had probably made them even more vulnerable, that their routine would be disrupted, that it was the perfect time to strike. He'd worked out all the details during the 4 days we'd been trapped inside. Entry points, timing, how to neutralize any resistance, how to transport the supplies back to our location. The way he talked about it made my skin crawl. This wasn't desperate survival planning. This was professional operational thinking. Mike described the family's daily routine with the kind of detail that came from extensive surveillance. He knew when they went to bed, when they woke up, how many people were in the house, what kind of weapons they had access to. He'd been planning this operation for weeks, maybe months. Sarah refused to participate. She said that attacking innocent people was exactly the kind of thing that separated humans from animals, that once we crossed that line, we'd lose everything that made us worth saving. She threatened to leave our group if we went through with Mike's plan, to take her chances on her own rather than be complicit in what she called cold-blooded murder. Mike's response was calm and logical and absolutely terrifying. He pointed out that Sarah knew too much about our operations to be allowed to leave. She knew where we kept our supplies, how our security systems worked, what our daily routines looked like. If she left our group and was captured by raiders, she could be forced to reveal information that would get us killed. He suggested that Sarah's departure would create an unacceptable security risk. The implication was clear. Mike wasn't just planning to rob and kill the family he'd been watching. He was also preparing to eliminate Sarah if she didn't cooperate with his plans. And if he was willing to kill Sarah, someone he'd been working with for months, someone he'd claimed to care about, then I had to assume he was planning to eliminate me too once I'd outlived my usefulness. That night, after Mike had returned to the Radio Shack and Sarah had gone back to her basement shelter, I made a decision that probably saved my life. I started moving my most essential supplies to hiding places that Mike didn't know about. Food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, anything I'd need to survive if I had to abandon the GameStop quickly. I worked through the night, using the layout of the store to create hidden caches in places Mike had never seen. I also started carrying my grandmother's revolver at all times, not just when I was outside the store, but even when I was moving around inside my own shelter. The weight of it in my jacket pocket was both comforting and terrifying, a reminder that I might have to use it against someone who'd been sharing meals with me for months. The next few days were a tense standoff. Mike kept pushing his plan to attack the family, providing more and more detailed intelligence about their defenses and routines. Sarah kept refusing to participate, arguing that we could find other solutions if we just tried harder. I found myself caught in the middle, pretending to consider Mike's suggestions while secretly preparing for the possibility that I'd have to defend myself against him. But Mike was smart. He'd been watching me just as carefully as he'd been watching the family he wanted to rob, and he could tell that my attitude toward his plans was changing. He started asking more pointed questions about my commitment to the group, my willingness to do what was necessary for our survival. He wanted to know if I was planning to side with Sarah against him, if I thought my moral squeamishness was more important than staying alive. That's when I realized that Mike had been testing me from the beginning. All those months of cooperation, all those shared meals and conversations about the future, all those times he'd helped me with technical problems or shared intelligence about threats in the area, He'd been evaluating my usefulness, my loyalty, my potential as either an asset or a threat. Sarah figured it out too. She started spending less time with our group, making excuses to avoid our evening planning sessions. When she did show up, she'd sit near the exit and keep her medical bag with her at all times. She was preparing to run, but she was also preparing for the possibility that running wouldn't be enough. The confrontation came on January 15th. Mike had decided that waiting any longer was too risky, that we needed to act while the family was still vulnerable from the storm. He wanted to strike that night, during the early morning hours when they'd be asleep and their guard would be down. He'd already scouted the approach route, identified the best way to get inside their house, planned how to neutralize any resistance quickly and quietly. Sarah told him absolutely not. She said she'd rather starve than participate in murdering innocent people, that she was leaving our group immediately and taking her chances on her own. She started packing her medical supplies, preparing to abandon the shelter she'd been living in for months. That's when Mike showed his true nature. Instead of trying to convince her to stay, instead of expressing regret about losing a valued member of our group, he started talking about the practical problems her departure would create. He said that Sarah had too much information about our operations, that she posed an unacceptable security risk, that we couldn't afford to let her leave with knowledge that could be used against us. Mike pulled out a knife. Not a kitchen knife or a utility blade, but a tactical fighting knife with a serrated edge and a grip designed for combat. He'd been carrying it the whole time, concealed under his jacket, and the casual way he displayed it suggested he'd used it before. He told Sarah that she could participate in the operation against the family, or she could be eliminated as a security threat. Those were her only options. That's when I understood what kind of person Mike really was. He wasn't a desperate survivor trying to stay alive in impossible circumstances. He was a predator who'd been using our group as cover while he planned to prey on other survivors. All those questions about community defenses, all that intelligence gathering about supply locations, all those detailed plans for acquiring resources through violence. He'd been preparing to become a raider himself, and he'd been planning to use Sarah and me as his first victims once we'd served our purpose. Sarah looked at me with those tired eyes that had seen too much violence, and I knew she was remembering the promise she'd made me make back in December. She wanted me to make sure her death was quick if she was ever in danger of being tortured or abused. She'd rather die with dignity than suffer the way Mrs. Chen had suffered, but I wasn't ready to give up on her yet. I told Mike that we needed to think about this rationally, that killing Sarah would leave us without medical expertise, that we should find a compromise that kept our group together. I was stalling for time, trying to figure out a way to get both of us out of this situation alive. Mike wasn't interested in compromise. He said that sentiment was a luxury we couldn't afford, that survival required making hard choices about who lived and who died. He pointed out that I was just as much of a security risk as Sarah, that I knew just as much about his plans and capabilities. The implication was clear. He was planning to eliminate both of us, probably that night after he'd used us to help him rob and kill the family he'd been watching. That's when I made the hardest decision of my life. I pulled out my grandmother's revolver and pointed it at Mike. My hands were shaking and I'd never aimed a weapon at another human being before, but I knew that if I didn't act immediately, Sarah and I were both going to die. Mike laughed. He said I didn't have the courage to pull the trigger, that I was too soft to survive in the new world, that he'd been planning to get rid of me for weeks anyway. He started moving toward me, the knife held casually in his hand like he was planning to use it for routine maintenance instead of murder. I told him to stop. I told him to put down the knife and walk away, that we could work out some kind of arrangement that didn't involve anyone getting hurt. But Mike kept moving, and I could see in his eyes that he'd already decided how this was going to end. He was going to kill me first, then Sarah, then go rob the family he'd been watching. 3 more victims in a winter that had already claimed too many lives. Sarah was pressed against the wall near the exit, her medical bag clutched in her hands like a shield. She was watching the confrontation with the same expression I'd seen on her face when she talked about treating gang members in Detroit emergency rooms. She knew what violence looked like, knew how quickly situations could escalate from words to bloodshed, Mike was maybe 6 feet away when he made his move. He lunged toward me with the knife, probably planning to disable me quickly before I could get a shot off. But I'd been practicing with the revolver for months, dry firing it in the back room, learning how the trigger felt, how to aim properly. All that practice paid off when I needed it most. I shot him twice, center mass, just like my grandmother had taught me when I was 12 years old, and she was trying to prepare me for a world she knew was more dangerous than I realized. Mike dropped the knife and fell backward, landing hard on the floor of the GameStop where I'd been selling video games and building communities just 10 months earlier. The gunshots were incredibly loud in the enclosed space, and my ears were ringing so badly I could barely hear anything else. But I could see Mike on the floor, breathing but not moving, blood spreading across his jacket in 2 dark stains. He was looking at me with this expression of surprise, like he couldn't believe I'd actually had the courage to pull the trigger. Sarah moved immediately, dropping her medical bag and checking Mike's wounds, professional instincts taking over despite everything that had just happened. She looked at me and shook her head. Mike was dying, probably had minutes at most, and there was nothing she could do to save him even if she'd wanted to. Mike tried to say something, but the words came out as a whisper. I couldn't understand over the ringing in my ears. Sarah leaned closer to hear what he was saying, then pulled, back with this look of disgust and horror on her face. She told me later that his last words had been about the family he'd been planning to rob, about how we were fools for passing up such an easy target, about how we deserved to starve for being too weak to take what we needed. He died maybe 3 minutes after I shot him, there on the floor of my store surrounded by gaming posters and empty display cases. I stood there holding the revolver, shaking so badly I could barely keep my grip on it, trying to process what had just happened. I'd killed someone. Someone I'd shared meals with, someone I'd trusted, someone I'd considered family for months. But Sarah wasn't giving me time to process the emotional impact. She was already moving, gathering her essential supplies and preparing to leave. She said we had to assume that other people had heard the gunshots, that raiders or other survivors might come to investigate. We needed to get out of the area immediately before anyone showed up looking for trouble. That's when Sarah told me she was leaving. Not just the store, not just our partnership, but the entire region. She said she couldn't stay in a place where survival required killing people, where every alliance was just a temporary arrangement between potential murderers. She'd rather take her chances alone in the wilderness than spend another day wondering which of her companions was planning to put a knife in her back. I begged her to stay. I pointed out that Mike had been the problem, that with him gone we could go back to being the kind of people who helped each other instead of preying on each other. But Sarah just shook her head. She said that killing Mike had been necessary, probably the only way to save both our lives, but it had also changed something fundamental about our situation. We'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Sarah also said something that haunts me to this day. She said that she'd seen the expression on my face when I pulled the trigger, the moment when I'd made the decision to take another person's life. She said it was the same expression she'd seen on the faces of gang members in Detroit emergency rooms, the look of someone who'd discovered they were capable of violence they'd never imagined. She was afraid of me. Not because she thought I was evil or dangerous, but because she knew that killing Mike had changed me in ways I didn't understand yet. She said that people who'd killed once found it easier to kill again, that survival situations had a way of eroding moral boundaries until good people became monsters without realizing it. Before she left, Sarah gave me her medical supplies and what food she could spare. She said I'd need them more than she would, that she had skills that would help her find shelter and resources wherever she ended up. She also gave me a piece of advice that probably saved my life during the weeks that followed. She told me to burn Mike's body and all evidence of what had happened. She said that if other survivors found out I'd killed someone, even in self-defense, they'd assume I was dangerous and either try to eliminate me or use the information as leverage against me. The post-apocalyptic world wasn't interested in legal justifications or moral complexities. Violence was violence, and people who were capable of it were threats to be managed. Sarah left that night, during a snowstorm that covered her tracks and made it impossible for anyone to follow her. I watched from the window as she disappeared into the darkness, carrying everything she owned in a single backpack, heading toward an uncertain future alone, rather than staying with someone she couldn't trust anymore. I spent the next 2 days dealing with Mike's body and cleaning up the evidence of our confrontation. I won't describe the details, but burning a human body with limited fuel and ventilation is harder than you might think. The smell lingered in the store for weeks, a constant reminder of what I'd done and what I'd become. But the hardest part wasn't the practical aspects of disposing of Mike's remains. The hardest part was accepting that Sarah had been right about the change in me. I'd killed someone, and while it had been necessary for my survival, it had also revealed something about my nature that I hadn't known existed. I was capable of taking a life to protect my own, and that knowledge changed everything about how I saw myself and my place in the world. The isolation that followed was worse than anything I'd experienced during the first months after the eruption. At least then I'd had hope that things would get better, that help was coming, that the world would eventually return to something resembling normal. Now I knew that the old world was gone forever, that survival meant becoming someone I'd never wanted to be, that the price of staying alive might be losing everything that made life worth living. I was completely alone in a store full of reminders of the person I used to be, surrounded by the silence of a dead city, carrying the weight of choices I couldn't undo. And winter was only half over. The weeks after Sarah left were the darkest of my life, and that's saying something considering I'd already lived through the end of the world. It wasn't just the isolation, though, that was brutal enough. It was the knowledge that I'd killed someone, that I'd crossed a line I'd never thought I'd have to cross, and that the person who'd known me best had been so afraid of what I might become that she'd chosen to face the wilderness alone rather than stay with me. I spent those weeks talking to myself constantly, having imaginary conversations with Sarah about whether I'd made the right choice, with Mike about whether there had been any other way to handle the situation, with my grandmother about what she'd really meant when she said peaceful men need to be ready for war. The silence of the empty store was driving me insane, and I found myself narrating my daily activities just to hear a human voice, even if it was my own. The practical side of survival became both easier and harder after Mike died. Easier because I no longer had to worry about someone planning to kill me in my sleep. Harder because I was completely on my own again with no one to watch my back or help with the work of staying alive. I had to be constantly alert, constantly planning, constantly ready for threats that could come from any direction. But the biggest challenge wasn't physical. It was psychological. I discovered something about myself that night in January, something I wasn't sure I could live with. I was capable of killing another human being when my survival depended on it. Not just capable, but willing. I'd pulled that trigger twice without hesitation, and part of me had felt relieved when Mike hit the floor and stopped being a threat. Sarah had been right about how killing someone changes you. It's not just the act itself, it's the knowledge that you're capable of it. Every time I encountered another survivor, every time I heard footsteps outside the store, every time someone approached my territory, I found myself calculating whether they represented a threat I'd need to eliminate. The mental framework for justifying violence was already in place, and it took conscious effort to resist using it. February was when I started hearing voices on the radio that gave me hope for the first time since Sarah left. Not the usual chatter between raider groups or desperate communications from isolated survivors, but organized professional voices coordinating what sounded like actual community operations. Supply distributions, medical services, security patrols, infrastructure repair. It sounded like someone was actually trying to rebuild civilization instead of just surviving in its ruins. The broadcasts were coming from the old Salvation Army building about 6 blocks from my location. The same building, where I'd seen smoke rising from the chimney. The same building I'd been too paranoid to investigate during the worst weeks of winter. Now I was listening to radio communications that suggested there was a real community there, with leadership structure and organized activities and actual plans for the future. I spent weeks monitoring their communications before I worked up the courage to make contact. The voices I heard sounded competent and professional, but I'd thought Mike sounded competent and professional too. And he'd turned out to be a psychopath who'd been planning to murder me for months. I needed to be absolutely certain about what kind of people I was dealing with before I revealed my location and capabilities. What I heard gave me cautious optimism. The community was led by someone with medical training who prioritized treating injured survivors regardless of their ability to pay. They had established security protocols that focused on protection rather than predation, using their resources to defend vulnerable people instead of attacking them. Most importantly, they seemed to have actual rules about conduct within their community, standards of behavior that prevented the kind of descent into savagery that had destroyed so many other groups. But I also heard things that reminded me why trusting other people was dangerous. References to people who'd been exiled from the community for violating their codes of conduct. Discussions about threats from other survivor groups who wanted to take their resources. Plans for defensive operations that sounded disturbingly similar to the attack strategies Mike had been developing. The difference was motivation. Mike had been planning to attack innocent people to steal their supplies. This community was planning to defend themselves against people who wanted to attack them. The tactics might be similar, but the moral framework was completely different. At least I hoped it was. I started making my own preparations for potential contact with this community in early March. I organized my remaining supplies, cataloging what I had to offer and what I might need from them. I practiced explaining my situation, how I'd survived the winter, what skills and resources I could contribute to their group. I also prepared for the possibility that the contact would go badly, that these people might turn out to be threats I'd need to defend against. The most important preparation was psychological. I had to decide whether I was ready to trust other people again after what had happened with Mike and Sarah, whether I could be part of a community without constantly calculating who might try to kill me and when, whether I could contribute to rebuilding civilization instead of just surviving in its aftermath. The decision wasn't easy. Part of me wanted to stay isolated, to avoid the risks that came with trusting other people, to maintain the independence I'd fought so hard to preserve. But another part of me was desperate for human connection, for the sense of purpose that came from being part of something larger than individual survival, for the hope that we could actually create something better from the ruins of the old world. I also had to confront the question of what to tell them about my past. Should I mention that I'd killed someone, even if it was in self-defense? Should I talk about Mike's betrayal and Sarah's departure? Or would that make me seem like damaged goods, someone who couldn't maintain stable relationships even in crisis situations? How much truth was too much truth when you were trying to join a community that valued trust and cooperation? The breakthrough came in late March when I finally worked up the courage to transmit a message on the frequency the community had been using. I kept it simple, identifying myself as a survivor in the area who was interested in making contact, offering my skills and resources in exchange for the possibility of joining their group. I didn't mention the GameStop specifically, didn't give away my exact location, didn't provide details that could be used against me if the contact went badly. The response came within hours. A calm, professional voice asking for more information about my background and capabilities, my current situation, and immediate needs. The questions were thorough but not invasive, designed to assess whether I'd be a good fit for their community without putting me at risk if I decided not to pursue the contact further. I spent days crafting my responses, trying to strike the right balance between honesty and caution. I talked about my experience managing retail operations, my skills with electronics and inventory management, my success at staying alive and relatively comfortable through the worst winter in recorded history. I mentioned that I'd lost contact with my previous survival partners without going into the details of why they'd left or what had happened to them. The community's representative seemed genuinely interested in my capabilities, particularly my organizational skills and experience with resource management. They explained that they were always looking for people who could contribute to their operations, who had skills that complemented their existing capabilities, who shared their values about cooperation and mutual aid. But they also made it clear that joining their community wasn't a casual decision. They had strict standards for membership, codes of conduct that everyone was expected to follow, consequences for people who violated their trust or endangered their security. They'd had to exile people in the past, and they weren't afraid to do it again if necessary. The conversation continued for over a week, with daily exchanges that gradually built trust and understanding between us. I learned that their community had about 30 members, including several people with medical training, former military personnel who handled security, skilled tradespeople who maintained their infrastructure, and ordinary people who contributed, through various forms of labor and support. They'd established their base in the Salvation Army building because it was large enough to house their entire community, had commercial kitchen facilities that could handle group meal preparation, and included meeting spaces where they could coordinate their activities and make collective decisions about their future. Most importantly, they'd developed a governance structure that prevented any single person from accumulating too much power or making unilateral decisions that affected the entire community. They'd learned from the failures of other survivor groups where charismatic leaders had become dictators or where internal conflicts had destroyed communities from within. After 2 weeks of radio contact, they invited me to visit their facility for a face-to-face meeting. They provided specific instructions for approaching their building safely, including recognition signals that would identify me as an expected visitor, rather than a potential threat. They also made it clear that this was just an initial meeting, that joining their community would require additional conversations and a probationary period, where I'd have to prove my compatibility with their values and operations. The day I decided to make contact was February 14, 2026, Valentine's Day. Though dates hardly mattered anymore in a world where survival took precedence over celebrating holidays. But there was something symbolic about choosing that particular day to take a chance on human connection again, to risk trusting other people after months of isolation and betrayal. I spent the morning preparing for the meeting, gathering essential supplies in case I needed to leave the GameStop permanently, making sure my grandmother's revolver was loaded and accessible but not obvious. I also spent time thinking about what I wanted to say, how I wanted to present myself, what questions I needed to ask to determine whether this community was really as good as it seemed. The walk to the Salvation Army building was the longest 6 blocks of my life. Not because of the physical distance, but because of the psychological weight of what I was doing. I was leaving the safety of my established territory, putting myself at the mercy of people I'd never met, taking a chance that they were genuinely interested in cooperation rather than just looking for new victims to exploit. The building itself looked exactly like what you'd expect from a community that was trying to rebuild civilization. Well-maintained despite the harsh winter, with visible security measures that suggested competence rather than paranoia, signs of ongoing activity, and organization that indicated these people had their act together. The person who met me at the entrance was a woman maybe 40 years old, with graying hair and calm eyes that suggested both intelligence and experience with difficult situations. She introduced herself as Dr. Martinez, the community's medical officer and one of their founding members. She explained that she'd been a trauma surgeon before the eruption, that she'd helped establish the community during the chaotic first months after the disaster. Dr. Martinez conducted what was essentially a job interview, asking detailed questions about my background, my survival experience, my skills and capabilities, but she also asked about my values, my approach to conflict resolution, my thoughts about what kind of society we should try to build from the ruins of the old world. These weren't just practical questions about whether I could contribute to their operations. They were moral questions about whether I'd fit into their community culture. I answered as honestly as I could without revealing information that might make me seem dangerous or unstable. I talked about my retail management experience, my success at staying alive through the winter, my desire to be part of something larger than individual survival. I also asked questions about their governance structure, their security protocols, their long-term plans for growth and development. The conversation lasted several hours, and by the end of it, I felt cautiously optimistic about the possibility of joining their community. Dr. Martinez seemed genuinely committed to the values she described, and the community she represented seemed like the kind of place where I could contribute meaningfully while maintaining my personal integrity. But she also made it clear that joining would require a leap of faith on both sides. They'd have to trust that I was who I claimed to be, that I shared their values, that I wouldn't betray their confidence or endanger their security. I'd have to trust that they were genuinely committed to cooperation and mutual aid, that they wouldn't exploit my vulnerabilities or use my resources against me. As I walked back to the GameStop that evening, I reflected on how much my life had changed since that first day when Mrs. Chen bought all those batteries and warned me about the long dark that was coming. I'd lost the world I'd known, discovered capabilities I'd never imagined I possessed, learned hard lessons about human nature and the price of survival. But I'd also learned something important about myself. Despite everything that had happened, despite the betrayals and violence and moral compromises I'd been forced to make, I was still capable of hope, still willing to take chances on other people, still committed to building something better than mere survival. The skills I'd developed managing a GameStop, dealing with difficult customers and organizing resources and building communities around shared interests, had turned out to be exactly the skills I needed to survive the end of the world. More importantly, they were the skills I could use to help rebuild it. Tomorrow I would make my decision about whether to join Dr. Martinez's community, whether to trust these strangers with my life and my future. But tonight, for the first time in months, I fell asleep feeling optimistic about what came next. This isn't the end of my story. It's just the beginning of what comes next. And if you're listening to this, if you've survived your own version of the long dark, maybe it's the beginning of your story too. Because the world didn't end when Yellowstone erupted. It just changed, and now it's up to us to decide what we want to build from what's left.